The marble floor was so polished you could see her soul in it. That's what Saren thought as she stared down at her reflection, distorted and small, while cameras clicked like hungry insects around her. The courtroom wasn't packed, but it felt like the whole world was watching. Her husband, no, ex-husband now, sat 3 feet away with the kind of posture that said he'd already won. Rowan Castile didn't just sign divorce papers. He executed them. Clean. Final. Like closing a bad investment. The pen scratched across the document with a sound that would haunt her for months. He didn't look at her. Not once. His lawyer slid the papers towards Saren, and she felt her hand shake as she reached for them. Everyone in that room thought they knew what was happening. A marriage ending. A woman losing. A rich man moving on. But they didn't know what was growing inside her. They didn't know that in 7 months, Rowan Castile would have a daughter he'd never asked for. Saren's fingers hovered over the signature line. She could feel the weight of his indifference pressing down on her chest like stones. 3 years of marriage reduced to 30 pages of legal terms and conditions. She thought about fighting, about screaming, about telling him right there that he was about to become a father. But something in his eyes, or rather, the lack of anything in his eyes, stopped her cold. This man didn't love her anymore. Maybe he never did. Love to Rowan was just another asset to acquire and discard when it stopped performing. So she signed. Her hand steadied as she wrote her name one last time as Mrs. Castile. The lawyer gathered the papers quickly, like he was afraid she might change her mind. Rowan stood up, buttoned his charcoal suit jacket, and finally looked at her. Not her face. At his watch. He had somewhere more important to be. He always did. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. Saren rose slowly from her chair, her cream dress hanging looser than it did a month ago. She'd stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping, stopped being the woman she used to be. Rowan turned to leave, his expensive shoes making sharp sound against the marble. That's when she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmur of lawyers and shuffling papers like a blade through silk. You'll regret this silence. He paused, just for a second. His shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. Someone in the gallery coughed. A camera flashed. Then Rowan Castile walked out of the courtroom like he was walking out of a bad restaurant, leaving Saren standing there with a secret that would destroy him and a heart that no longer knew how to beat properly. The lawyers packed up their briefcases. The judge dismissed the session. The reporters rushed out to file their stories about another celebrity divorce, another woman scorned, another billionaire moving on. But none of them saw what Saren saw on the polished marble floor as she bent to pick up her purse. Her reflection wasn't small anymore. It was gathering itself, preparing, transforming into something Rowan Castile would never see coming. She placed one hand on her stomach, still flat, still hiding her truth. Then she walked out of that courthouse with her head high and her heart broken, not knowing that in exactly 10 months, she would walk back into Rowan's life and watch his empire crumble like sand through fingers. Outside, the November wind cut through her thin coat. She had nowhere to go. Her parents were gone. Her friends had chosen Rowan's side when the gossip started. She had $1,700 in her personal account and a secret that would either save her or ruin her. As she stood on the courthouse steps watching black cars rush past, she made herself a promise. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't break. She would disappear so completely that when she returned, no one would recognize the weapon she'd become. What Saren did in the months that followed would either destroy her completely or turn her into something untouchable. So here's my question for you. If someone betrayed you that deeply, would you seek revenge, or would you rebuild yourself so powerfully that your success becomes the revenge? Drop your answer below. The bus smelled like diesel and regret. Saren pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching the city skyline shrink behind her like a bad memory fading. She'd spent her last $200 on a one-way ticket to Cypress Bay, a coastal town she'd only seen once in a travel magazine at the dentist's office. It looked peaceful, quiet, the kind of place where nobody asked questions about why you showed up with one suitcase and eyes that couldn't stop crying. The pregnancy test in her purse felt heavier than it should. 3 pink lines. Positive. Undeniable. She was carrying Rowan Castell's child, and he was probably already planning his next conquest while she was running to a town that didn't even have a Starbucks. The irony tasted bitter. She'd given him everything: her trust, her youth, her dreams of becoming a designer. And he'd given her divorce papers and a baby he'd never know about. Cypress Bay was smaller than she imagined. The main street had a bakery, a clinic, a post office, and a bar that looked like it had seen better decades. She rented a room above the bakery for $300 a month. The owner, Mrs. Chun, was 70 and didn't care about Saren's past as long as the rent came on time. The room had one window that overlooked the ocean and a bed that creaked every time she breathed. It was perfect because it was the opposite of everything Rowan had built. No morbid, no meters, no reminders of the woman she used to be. She got a job at the bakery the next morning. Minimum wage. 4 a.m. shifts. Her hands, which used to hold designer sketches and champagne glasses, now shaped dough and scrubbed flour from under her fingernails. The work was brutal. Her back ached. Her feet swelled. But something strange happened in those early morning hours while the ovens hummed and the sun hadn't yet decided to rise. She started remembering who she was before Rowan, before the mansion, before she traded her identity for a last name that never fit. 3 months into her exile, she collapsed. Right there between the mixer and the cooling racks, her vision went white and her knees gave out like someone cut the strings. Mrs. Chun called the clinic, and that's how Sarah met Dr. Elias Monroe. He had kind eyes and hands that didn't shake when he helped her onto the exam table. He checked her pulse, asked gentle questions, and somehow knew not to push when she couldn't answer them. "You're malnourished," he said, writing something on his notepad, "and about 4 months pregnant." Saren's breath caught. She hadn't told anyone, hadn't admitted it out loud. Elias handed her a bottle of prenatal vitamins and a business card with his personal number written on the back. "I don't know your story," he said, meeting her eyes with the kind of honesty that felt dangerous. "But I know that look. You're running from something. That's fine. Just don't run from taking care of yourself." She wanted to hate his kindness. It felt like pity, but when he smiled, soft and without expectation, something in her chest that had been locked tight for months cracked open just a little. He didn't ask for her real name, didn't Google her face, didn't treat her like she was broken. He treated her like she mattered, which was more than her husband had done in years. Over the next few months, Elias became her quiet anchor. He'd stop by the bakery for coffee, never mentioning the baby unless she brought it up first. They'd talk about simple things: weather, books, the way the ocean looked different every morning. He never touched her, never crossed lines. But there was something building between them that felt like the beginning of trust, and trust was a language Saren had forgotten how to speak. On a January morning, with snow falling rare and soft on the beach, Saren went into labor alone in her small room above the bakery. Elias arrived within minutes of her call, steady and sure, and he held her hand through every contraction like he'd been preparing for this moment his whole life. When her daughter was born, tiny and screaming and absolutely perfect, Sarah named her Hope. Because that's what she was. Proof that something beautiful could come from something shattered. What Saren didn't know was that Elias recognized her the moment she walked into his clinic. He knew exactly who Rowan Castell was, and he'd been keeping that secret locked away, waiting for the right time to tell her why. Have you ever met someone who changed your life without even trying? Someone who showed up exactly when you needed them? Tell me about it in the comments. Hope was 6 months old when Saren's mother's journals changed everything. She'd found them in a box she'd been too afraid to open, tucked between baby blankets and the few possessions she'd salvaged from her old life. Her mother, Eleanor, had died 2 years before Saren met Rowan. She'd been a wellness coach before wellness was trendy, writing about natural remedies, mindful living, and the art of building beauty from broken things. Her words felt prophetic now, like she'd known her daughter would need them someday. Saren started small. A blog, recipes her mother had taught her, essays about rebuilding after loss, photos of the ocean at dawn, and Hope's tiny hands reaching for sunlight. She called it Phoenix Bloom, a name that felt both obvious and inevitable. She had no expectations, no strategy, She just needed to create something that was hers, something Rowan's money and lawyers couldn't touch. The universe had other plans. Her third post went viral. 20,000 shares in 2 days. Then 50,000. Then 100. People were starving for a message. For the raw honesty of a woman who'd lost everything and was teaching herself to breathe again. Brands started reaching out. Small ones first, then bigger names. Within 6 months, Phoenix Bloom had a website, a product line, and a social media following that made marketing executives drool. Saren hired a lawyer to set up an LLC under a shell company. Everything was kept separate from her real identity. The face of Phoenix Bloom was carefully curated, elegant, but distant enough that Rowan Castile, who never paid attention to wellness trends, wouldn't recognize his ex-wife in the woman building an empire from a bakery in Cypress Bay. She designed everything herself, pulling from skills she'd buried during her marriage. Packaging, branding, the entire aesthetic. It felt like putting pieces of herself back together, one design at a time. By Hope's first birthday, Phoenix Bloom had made its first million. Saren stared at the bank statement for 20 minutes, convinced it was a mistake. But it wasn't. Her mother's philosophy, combined with Saren's design skills and the hunger of a woman with nothing left to lose, had created something powerful. Something that was about to intersect with Rowan's world in ways neither of them could predict. The call came on a Tuesday. Phoenix Bloom's business manager, a sharp woman named Rita who didn't ask unnecessary questions, had news. Castile Corporation wanted to partner with Phoenix Bloom for their luxury hospitality division. They were rebranding their high-end hotels and needed a wellness consultant and designer. The contract was worth $3 million. Saren's hands went numb. Rowan didn't know. He couldn't know. His company had reached out through acquisition channels, blind to the fact that the woman behind Phoenix Bloom was the same woman he discarded like faulty merchandise. Rita was waiting for an answer, but Saren couldn't speak. This was the moment. The door opening. The universe handing her an invitation to walk back into Rowan's life, not as a victim, but as a force he'd never see coming. Accept it, Saren finally said. But keep our identity strictly confidential. All communications through intermediaries. That's when Rita mentioned the other news. Rowan Castile was getting married. 10 days from now. To supermodel Celeste Vale. And here's where the story twisted into something darker. Celeste Vale wasn't just any supermodel. She was Saren's half-sister. Same father, different mothers. They'd met exactly twice in their lives, both times ending in bitter silence. Their father had favored Celeste, the beautiful one, the successful one, leaving Saren with scraps of attention and an inheritance that barely covered college. Saren had never told Rowan about Celeste. Why would she? They weren't close. They weren't anything. But now Rowan was marrying her, which meant either he didn't know about their connection or he did, and this was his final insult. Either way, the universe had just handed Saren a gift wrapped in irony and dipped in gasoline. She looked at Hope, sleeping in her crib with tiny fists curled under her chin. Then she looked at the contract from Castile Corporation. Then she made a decision that would either destroy her or set her free. She was going to design Rowan's wedding. Every flower, every detail, every single element that would celebrate his union with her sister. And she was going to do it so beautifully that when the truth came out, the beauty would make the betrayal hurt even more. Phoenix Bloom accepted the contract the next morning. The countdown had begun. 10 days until Rowan Castile's wedding. 10 days until Saren walked back into his world. And nobody, not even Elias, who was watching her with worried eyes, could stop what was coming. What would you do if your ex married your sister? Would you walk away, or would you show up and let them see what they lost? The anonymous messages started small. An email to Rowan's chief operating officer, then a text to his head of investor relations, then a note delivered to his personal assistant's desk. All of them said variations of the same thing. The woman you destroyed is coming back. The woman you underestimated is already here. The woman you forgot is about to remind you of everything you threw away. Rowan dismissed them. He had 100 enemies and 1,000 people who wanted to see him fall. Anonymous threats were part of the territory when you built empires on ruthless decisions and cold calculations. His security team traced the messages to burner phones and encrypted servers that led nowhere. Whoever was sending them knew what they were doing. But Rowan had a wedding to finalize and a merger to close, so he filed the warnings under noise and moved on. What he didn't know was that Phoenix Bloom's design team had already been inside his venue for 3 days. Saren had sent her best people, but she designed every element herself. White orchids that symbolized death in some cultures and rebirth in others. Mirrors positioned to reflect and distort. Lighting that would shift from romantic to stark with the flip of a switch. Every detail carried a double meaning, a hidden message that only she would understand until the moment she wanted everyone else to see it too. She worked from her laptop in Cypress Bay, video calling with her team, adjusting arrangements, perfecting the illusion. Hope laid on a blanket beside her, babbling at her toes, completely unaware that her mother was orchestrating the most elegant destruction of a man's life that high society had ever witnessed. Elias stopped by most evenings, bringing dinner and concern in equal measure. "You know this could backfire," he said one night, watching her adjust a digital mock-up of the ceremony space. "You walk back into his world, and you risk everything you've built." Saren didn't look up from her screen. "I'm not walking back into his world, Elias. I'm showing him that he never left mine. There's a difference." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that made her hands stop moving. "I need to tell you something. About Rowan. About why I left New York." She finally looked at him. His face carried the weight of a confession he'd been holding for months. Elias set down the container of soup he'd brought and sat across from her, his hands clasped together like he was praying for the right words. "I was his business partner. 7 years ago. Before he met you. We built Castile Corporation together. My medical technology patents, his business ruthlessness. It worked until I saw what he was willing to do to win. He stole designs from smaller companies, crushed competitors by destroying their personal lives. He offered me a deal that would have made us both billionaires, but required ruining a single mother startup that was developing the same technology. I said no. He did it anyway. So I walked away, sold my shares, and moved to Cypress Bay to practice medicine the way it should be practiced, without casualties." The room felt smaller suddenly. Saren's mind was racing, connecting dots she didn't know existed. "You knew who I was the whole time. From the moment you collapsed in the bakery. I recognized you from the wedding photos that were all over the business journals. I stayed quiet because you deserved privacy. You deserved safety. And honestly, I was afraid that if you knew I had history with Rowan, you'd run from the only person in this town who actually gave a damn about you." Saren should have been angry, should have felt betrayed. But instead, she felt something shift into place. Elias wasn't just a kind doctor who happened to care. He was someone who knew exactly what Rowan was capable of and chose to protect her anyway. He was living proof that Rowan destroyed everything he touched, even partnerships that should have been unbreakable. "Does he know you're here?" she asked. "No. I made sure of that when I left. Changed my practice name. Kept low profile. But if you go to that wedding, he'll eventually connect the dots. And when he does, this becomes bigger than just you getting closure. This becomes war." Saren closed her laptop, picked up Hope, who immediately grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair and giggled. She thought about Rowan sitting in his penthouse right now, probably reviewing contracts or planning his honeymoon, completely unaware that the two people he discarded were about to show him what happens when you underestimate quiet people. "Good," she said. "Let be war. I'm done hiding." Elias nodded slowly, and something passed between them. An understanding. A pact. They were in this together now, whether Rowan liked it or not. The wedding was 6 days away. The flowers were ordered. The venue was set. And Saren had just secured her invitation through a technicality in the vendor contract that required the lead designer to be present for final adjustments. What she planned was a revenge. Revenge was loud and messy and temporary. What she planned was revelation. The kind that burns slow and leaves scars that never heal. If someone who wronged you was about to have their perfect moment, would you let them have it, or would you show up and remind them of what they did? Drop your thoughts below. The city looked different from the hotel window. Saren stood there at 3 in the morning, Hope asleep in the crib the hotel had provided, watching New York's lights bleed into the dark sky. She hadn't been back here in 18 months. The last time she'd seen these streets, she'd been leaving in shame. Now she was back wearing armor made of success and silence. Tomorrow was Rowan's wedding. Tonight was the rehearsal dinner, a black-tie affair for 200 of society's most powerful people. Saren had her invitation buried in her bag, the vendor credential that would let her walk right into the viper's nest. She'd chosen her dress weeks ago. Simple, black, the kind of elegant that made people look twice because it didn't try too hard. Her hair was different now, longer and styled with the confidence of a woman who'd survived the worst and came out refined by fire. She thought about calling Elias, but he was back in Cypress Bay with strict instructions to keep Hope's existence quiet until Saren decided otherwise. This was something she needed to do alone. This moment of walking back into Rowan's world belonged only to her and the ghosts of who she used to be. Flashbacks hit without permission. Their wedding day. Rowan had looked at her like she was the most valuable acquisition he'd ever made. She'd mistaken that look for love. How stupid she'd been. How naive to think a man who treated business like war would treat marriage like partnership. She remembered their last anniversary, how he'd forgotten it completely until his assistant reminded him at 8 p.m. He'd sent flowers. Expensive ones. Empty ones. Flowers that said, "I pay people to remember you, so I don't have to." A knock at the door pulled her back to the present. Room service, probably. She'd ordered tea hours ago and forgotten about it. But when she opened the door, Elias stood there with his jacket wrinkled and his eyes tired and a small overnight bag in his hand. "You weren't supposed to come," she said, but she was already stepping aside to let him in. "I know, but I couldn't let you do this alone. Hope's with Mrs. Chun. She's fine. I'm here for exactly as long as you need me. Then I disappear." "Deal." Saren felt something crack in her chest. Not breaking. Opening. She'd been so focused on being strong that she'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone stand beside her. Elias set his bag down and pulled out a thermos of actual good tea, the kind they couldn't get in hotel rooms. They sat by the window, not talking much, just existing in the same space while the city buzzed below them. "I need to tell you something," Elias said after a while, "and I need you to listen without interrupting." She nodded. "I've loved you since the day you collapsed in that bakery. Not because you were broken or because I wanted to save you. I loved you because even in your worst moment, you were thinking about how to get back up. You didn't ask for pity. You asked for prenatal vitamins and a job schedule that would let you keep working. I've watched you build an empire from nothing while raising a baby alone. And every single day, I've wanted to tell you that you're the most extraordinary person I've ever met. But you weren't ready. You needed to find yourself first. So I waited, and I'll keep waiting. Even if you never feel the same way. Even if tomorrow destroys everything. I just needed you to know that you're not alone. You never were." Saren couldn't speak. Tears came without sound, running down her face like they'd been waiting for permission. She reached for his hand, and he held it like it was made of glass and steel at the same time. They stayed like that until sunrise started painting the sky pink and gold. Two people who'd been broken by the same man, finding something like peace in each other's silence. At noon, Saren dressed for the rehearsal dinner. Applied makeup that made her look rested instead of wrecked. Put on the black dress that fit her like confidence. Elias had already left to check on venue details, playing the role of her assistant for the day. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. This wasn't the girl who'd signed divorce papers while cameras flashed. This was someone new. Someone forged in isolation and heartbreak and the fierce determination to never be underestimated again. The rehearsal dinner was at the same hotel where Rowan had proposed 3 years ago. Saren walked in veiled, not dramatically, but enough that people wouldn't immediately recognize her. She watched from the back as Rowan stood at the center of attention, his arm around Celeste, who sparkled like she'd been dipped in diamonds and ambition. They looked perfect together. Two beautiful people who'd never known real struggle or consequence. But then something happened that made Saren's blood turn to ice. She overheard two investors talking by the bar, their voices low but not low enough. They were discussing Castile Corporation's financials. How Rowan had built his empire on ideas that weren't his. How the wellness division that was about to make him billions was developed by his ex-wife before they divorced. How he'd stolen her concepts, her designs, her entire vision, and repackaged it as his own innovation. Saren's hands shook. She'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed, hearing them laugh about how ruthless and brilliant he was for taking credit for her work, made something snap into place. This wasn't just about a failed marriage. This was about theft, erasure, the systematic destruction of her worth so he could build his. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to her lawyer. Release everything. Tomorrow at the wedding, the truth wouldn't just come out. It would detonate. And Rowan Castile would finally understand what it felt like to lose everything while everyone watched. Have you ever discovered that someone took credit for your work? What did you do about it? The doors were 14 feet tall, hand-carved mahogany that probably cost more than most people's houses. Saren stood behind them, listening to the string quartet playing inside, feeling her heartbeat in her throat. She could still leave. Walk away. Let Rowan have his perfect day with her sister and his stolen empire. But then she thought about Hope, asleep back at the hotel, and how one day her daughter would ask about her father. And Saren refused to tell that story from a place of silence and shame. The wedding coordinator gave her the signal. The doors opened. Music shifted. Every head in that room turned toward the entrance, expecting a late guest or perhaps a wedding party member. What they got instead was Saren Vale, walking down the aisle in a dress that wasn't white, but wasn't quite black either, something in between that caught the light and held it. She moved with the kind of grace that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The room went silent. Not the good kind of silent. The kind where 300 wealthy people collectively held their breath because they smelled scandal and blood in the water. Saren's heels clicked against marble, each step measured and deliberate. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't hesitating. She was simply walking toward the front of that church like she had every right to be there. Rowan saw her before Celeste did. His face drained of color, so fast it looked like someone had pulled the plug. He gripped the podium beside him, knuckles going white, mouth opening but no sound coming out. Beside him, Celeste turned to see what had stolen her groom's attention. When she recognized Saren, her perfect makeup couldn't hide the way her expression crumbled. She knew. In that instant, she knew this wedding was over before the vows even started. Saren stopped halfway down the aisle. Didn't go all the way to the altar. Didn't need to. She had everyone's attention now, including the reporters who'd been invited to document this society wedding for the glossy magazines. Cameras were already flashing. Phones were already recording. This moment was about to go viral, and there was nothing Rowan's lawyers could do to stop it. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Saren said, her voice carrying through the space with unexpected strength. "But I couldn't let this continue without everyone knowing the truth." Rowan found his voice. "Saren, don't do this. Whatever you think you're doing, just stop." She smiled. It wasn't cruel. It was sad. The kind of sad that comes from watching someone realize they've lost everything and understanding the reason why. "I'm not here for revenge, Rowan. I'm here for revelation." There's a difference. The guests were leaning forward now, desperate not to miss a single word. Celeste looked like she wanted to run, but her dress was too heavy and her heels too high. She was trapped in her own fairy tale while it turned into a nightmare. Rowan's best man tried to step forward, probably to escort Saren out, but Rowan held up a hand to stop him. "What do you want?" Rowan asked, and for the first time in 3 years, Saren heard something real in his voice. "Fear. I want them to know who you really are. I want them to know that Phoenix Bloom, the company you've been partnering with, the brand that's about to make your hospitality division billions, was built by me. Every concept you stole from our marriage. Every design I sketched while you were too busy with meetings to notice I existed. Every recipe my mother taught me that you dismissed as worthless. I took all of it, rebuilt it, and made it into something you couldn't ignore. And you never knew. You were so convinced I was nothing without your name that you never looked closely enough to see I was becoming everything without it." The room erupted in whispers. Investors pulled out phones, probably already checking facts, running searches, connecting dots. Saren watched Rowan's face as understanding crashed over him like a wave. "Phoenix Bloom. The mysterious designer who transformed his brand. The faceless genius behind the viral wellness movement. It was her. It had always been her. But Saren wasn't done. She pulled a small envelope from her clutch and held it up. This contains documentation proving that Castile Corporation's entire wellness division was built on intellectual property stolen from me during our marriage. Designs I created. Concepts I developed. My lawyer filed the preliminary injunction an hour ago. Your investors are receiving copies as we speak. By Monday morning, your company will be fighting lawsuits that will freeze your assets and destroy your reputation. Rowan's legs seemed to give out. He sat down hard on the altar steps, head in his hands. Celeste finally found her voice. You're lying. You're just bitter and pathetic, and you can't stand that he moved on. Saren turned to her half-sister, and there was no anger in her eyes. Just pity. I'm not bitter, Celeste. I'm free. And you're about to marry a man who steals everything he can't buy. Good luck with that. When Saren spoke her final words, the entire congregation knew the wedding was over and nothing would ever be the same again. What would you do in this moment? Would you have the courage to speak your truth in front of everyone, or would you stay silent? The aftermath happened in slow motion. Celeste ripped off her veil and threw it at Rowan before running out a side door, her bridesmaids scrambling after her like confused ducklings. Several investors stood up immediately, making calls, their faces tight with the kind of anger that comes from being associated with potential fraud. The priest, looking thoroughly out of his depth, suggested everyone take a moment to collect themselves, which was religious speak for this wedding is canceled, and please leave quietly. Rowan finally stood up. He looked at Saren like he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, and what he saw terrified him. This wasn't the broken woman who'd signed divorce papers in silence. This was someone who'd learned to weaponize patience and turn survival into strategy. He took a step toward her, but his head of security intercepted him, whispering urgently in his ear, probably about damage control, probably about how the video of this confrontation was already trending online with hashtags like Justice for Saren and Phoenix Bloom Revenge. You destroyed me, Rowan said, his voice cracking. Everything I built, everything I worked for. Saren tilted her head, studying him like he was a stranger. No, Rowan, you destroyed yourself. I just stopped letting you use my silence as a building material. There's a difference. The remaining guests were filing out now, some throwing sympathetic glances at Saren, others looking at her like she was dangerous. Good. She wanted to be dangerous. She wanted every person in that room to go home and tell the story of the woman who rose from the ashes of her own marriage and burned down the empire that was built on her bones. But then Rowan said something that made her pause. You want to know the worst part? I loved you. I actually loved you, Saren. I was just too stupid and too scared to know how to show it. By the time I realized what I'd lost, you were gone. And I convinced myself you were better off without me. I convinced myself I did you a favor. For a moment, just a heartbeat, Saren felt something soften. Then she remembered the night she'd begged him to come home for dinner and he'd sent his assistant with excuses and a credit card. She remembered the way he'd looked through her at parties, like she was furniture. She remembered signing those divorce papers alone while he was already planning his future with someone else. You didn't love me, Rowan. You loved the idea of me. The version that stayed quiet and small and grateful. The moment I grew beyond that, I stopped being useful. That's not love. That's ownership. His phone was ringing nonstop now. His CFO appeared at the church entrance, face pale, gesturing frantically. The press was gathering outside. Shareholders were demanding emergency meetings. Everything was unraveling exactly as Saren had designed it to. Rowan's security team was trying to usher him toward a back exit, but he kept looking at Saren like she was a puzzle he'd never learned to solve. Is there anything I can do? He asked, and for the first time since she'd known him, he sounded small. Anything at all to fix this? Saren considered lying, considered giving him false hope. But she'd spent too long learning how to be honest, even when honesty cut like glass. You can let me go. You can stop trying to own things that were never yours. You can learn that some mistakes don't get fixed. They just get learned from. She turned to leave, but Rowan grabbed her arm. Not hard. Desperate. Wait. Please. Is there something else? Something you're not telling me. For a second, she almost told him about hope. Almost said the words that would shatter what was left of his composure. But then she thought about her daughter's face, innocent and perfect, and she realized hope deserved better than being used as a final weapon. Some truths were too precious to deploy in war. There's nothing else, she lied. We're done, Rowan. We were done the moment you decided I wasn't worth your time. She pulled her arm free and walked out of that church with her head high and her purpose complete. Behind her, she heard Rowan collapse again, this time with a sound that might have been a sob. She didn't turn around, didn't give him the satisfaction of her sympathy. She'd given him 3 years of her life and 18 months of her silence. He didn't get her tears, too. Outside, Elias was waiting by a car, exactly as they'd planned. He opened the door for her without asking how it went. He could see it in her face. The mixture of victory and exhaustion. The relief of finally speaking truth after swallowing lies for so long. They drove back to the hotel in silence. And it wasn't until they were in the elevator that Saren finally let herself breathe. It's done, she whispered. It's finally done. But she was wrong, because an hour later, Rowan showed up at her hotel room door. And what he said next changed everything. Have you ever confronted someone who hurt you? Did it bring you closure or just more questions? Tell me your story.
Saren opened the hotel door to find Rowan standing there looking like he'd aged 10 years in 2 hours. His tuxedo was rumpled, tie gone, hair messed up from running his hands through it too many times. His security team waited by the elevators, giving him space but staying close. He looked at her with eyes that were red-rimmed and desperate, and she hated that part of her still recognized the man she'd once loved underneath all the damage. "How did you find my room?" she asked, blocking the doorway. "I own the hotel." His voice was flat, defeated. "I own half the city, Saren. But apparently, I never owned the one thing that mattered." She should have slammed the door, should have called security. Instead, she stepped aside and let him in, keeping the door open enough that she could scream if needed. Rowan walked to the window and stared out at the city he was about to lose, his hands shaking slightly. "My lawyer's called. The injunction is legitimate. The documentation is airtight. By Monday, I'll be fighting lawsuits from 12 different directions. My investors are pulling out. The board is demanding my resignation. Castile Corporation will survive, but I won't. Everything I built is collapsing, and the worst part is I deserve it." Saren crossed her arms, waited. She'd learned that silence made people fill empty space with truth. "I went through our old apartment today," Rowan continued. "The one we shared before I bought the penthouse. I haven't been there in 3 years. My assistant's been paying the rent, but I never sold it. I don't know why. Maybe I knew someday I'd need to remember who I was before I became this." He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a small leather journal. "I found this. Your design book. The one you kept hidden because you thought I'd dismiss it." Saren's breath caught. She'd forgotten about that book. Filled with sketches and ideas and dreams she'd been too afraid to share, because Rowan always had a way of making her passions feel small. "I read every page," he said, his voice breaking. "Every single one. And I realized that Phoenix Bloom isn't just built on your ideas. It's built on the version of you I spent 3 years trying to erase. The creative, brilliant, unstoppable version that threatened me because it meant you didn't need me. So I made you doubt yourself. Made you think your dreams were hobbies. Made you so small that when I finally left, you actually believed you were nothing." He turned to face her, and there were tears running down his face that might have been manipulation, except his whole body was shaking. "I didn't come here to beg. I came here to tell you that you were right. About everything. I didn't love you. I consumed you. And now I'm watching everything I stole turn to ash, and all I can think about is that I deserve worse." Saren felt her own eyes burning, but she refused to cry. "Not for him. Not anymore. Why are you telling me this, Rowan? What do you want? I want you to know that I see you now. Really see you. And I'm sorry. I know that word means nothing coming from me. I know apologies don't rebuild trust or undo damage. But I needed to say it anyway, because living the rest of my life knowing I destroyed the only real thing I ever had is going to be punishment enough." He set the journal on the table and turned to leave, but something made Saren speak. "Rowan, wait." He froze, hope flickering across his face like a dying candle. I need to tell you something. Something I've been keeping from you. This was the moment. The choice. Tell him about Hope, their daughter sleeping in the next room, and give him the chance to be a father. Or keep that secret locked away, protecting her child from a man who'd proven he destroyed everything he touched. But before she could decide, Hope cried out from the bedroom. That small, distinctive sound that meant she was waking up from her nap. Rowan's head snapped toward the sound, confusion crossing his face. Is that a baby? Saren's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. This wasn't how she'd planned it. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. But the universe had its own timeline, and apparently, it had decided that tonight was the night Rowan Castile learned he was a father. She walked to the bedroom door and opened it. Hope was standing in her travel crib, tiny hands gripping the rails, her dark hair messy from sleep. She looked at Saren and smiled, then noticed the stranger in the room and went quiet, studying him with the serious expression babies get when they're deciding if someone is safe. Rowan stared at Hope, then at Saren, then back at Hope. He wasn't stupid. He could do the math, could see his own eyes looking back at him from that small face. His legs gave out for the second time that day, and he sat down hard on the floor, hand over his mouth, whole body going rigid with shock. How old? His voice was barely a whisper. 14 months. When were you going to tell me? Saren knelt down and picked up Hope, who immediately buried her face in her mother's neck, peeking at Rowan with curious eyes. I wasn't. You signed away your rights to my life when you signed those divorce papers. I wasn't going to let you sign away hers too. Rowan made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh or something in between. He crawled closer, staying low, non-threatening. Hope watched him with the kind of judgment only toddlers and very old people can pull off. Then she reached out and grabbed his finger, and Rowan completely fell apart. What would you do if you discovered you had a child you never knew about? What would you say? 6 months later, Cypress Bay looked different in spring. The flowers Saren had planted outside Phoenix Bloom's new headquarters were in full bloom, creating a garden that drew tourists and locals alike. The company had moved beyond online presence into a full lifestyle brand with stores in 12 cities and a valuation that made financial magazines write profiles calling Saren the architect of conscious luxury. She'd done 3 interviews, declined 50 more. Let her work speak louder than her words. Hope was walking now, toddling around the garden with the kind of fearless confidence that came from being loved unconditionally. She chased butterflies and laughed at everything and had no idea that her existence had changed 3 people's lives in ways that couldn't be undone. Rowan visited twice a month, every other weekend, exactly as the custody agreement stipulated. He'd lost Castile Corporation, lost his board seat, lost everything except a trust fund he'd never touched because he'd always been too proud to rely on family money. Now he lived in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, worked as a consultant, and spent his free time learning how to be the kind of father who showed up. The first few visits had been awkward. Hope didn't know him. Saren didn't trust him. But slowly, painfully, something shifted. Rowan would sit on the floor and play blocks with Hope for hours, never checking his phone, never acting like he had somewhere better to be. He brought books and read them in funny voices. He learned that Hope liked strawberries but hated bananas. He figured out how to braid her hair after watching 7 YouTube tutorials. He never asked Saren for forgiveness, never tried to rebuild what they'd had. He understood, finally, that some things stay broken. But he showed up for his daughter with the kind of dedication he'd once reserved for hostile takeovers, and that counted for something. Today was different, though. Today, Elias was here, and Rowan knew what that meant. He'd seen the way Elias looked at Saren, the way she'd started smiling more when Elias stopped by the office, the way Hope called him Eli and reached for him the same way she reached for her mother. Rowan sat on a bench in the garden while Saren and Elias stood by the fountain, talking in low voices. He watched them the way someone watches a movie they've already seen, knowing the ending but unable to look away. Elias said something that made Saren laugh, really laugh, to sound bright and genuine. Then Elias took her hand, and even from a distance, Rowan could see the question being asked. Saren looked at Elias for a long moment. Then she looked at Hope, playing in the grass nearby. Then, briefly, she looked at Rowan. He didn't know what she saw in his face. Regret, probably. Acceptance. Maybe even something like blessing. He nodded just slightly, and she turned back to Elias and said something that made him light up like sunrise. Elias pulled a small box from his pocket. Simple ring. Nothing flashy. Just a promise made in a garden on a spring day with a toddler as their witness. Saren said yes. Elias slipped the ring on her finger. They kissed, soft and certain, like people who'd earned their happiness through patience and pain. Rowan felt something crack in his chest. Not jealousy exactly, something more like grief for the man he could have been if he'd learned these lessons earlier. If he'd understood that love wasn't about possession, that partnership wasn't about power, that the strongest thing a man could do was step aside and let the woman he destroyed find peace with someone better. Later, after Elias left and Hope was napping, Saren joined Rowan on the bench. They sat in silence for a while, watching the ocean in the distance, both thinking about paths not taken and choices that couldn't be undone. "I'm happy for you," Rowan said, and he meant it. "He's a good man, better than I ever was." Saren didn't argue. "He taught me that kindness isn't weakness, that showing up is more important than showing off, that I deserve to be chosen every single day, not just when it was convenient. Will you let me keep seeing hope, as long as you keep showing up the way you have been? The moment you revert to the man who puts business over people, we're done. Understand? Understand." Another silence. Then Saren asked the question that had been hanging between them for months. "Do you regret it? Everything that happened?" Rowan thought about the empire he'd lost, the life he'd destroyed, the woman he'd underestimated so completely that she'd had to burn his world down just to be seen. "I regret hurting you. I regret being too stupid to value what I had. But I don't regret the consequences. I deserved all of it. And honestly, losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me. It's the only thing that made me human again." Sarah nodded, stood up, extended her hand. "Then I hope you stay human, Rowan. For Hope's sake." He shook her hand, and it felt like a treaty, like the formal end of a war neither of them had wanted, but both had needed. She walked back toward the building, and Rowan stayed on that bench watching the sun set over Cypress Bay, thinking about how some men lose fortunes chasing beauty, and the truly lucky ones get to watch that beauty walk away and build something magnificent without them. Phoenix Bloom's stock price hit an all-time high that week. Saren was featured on the cover of 3 magazines. And in a small coastal town where nobody asked unnecessary questions, a woman who'd been broken finally learned what it meant to be whole. When life breaks you down, do you crumble or do you rebuild yourself into something stronger? Tell me your rebuilding story. Let me tell you something about endings. They're never as clean as we want them to be. Stories don't wrap up with perfect bows and fade to black moments like movies make you believe. Real life is messy, harder, more beautiful because of the mess. 3 years after that wedding that never happened, Saren stood in her office overlooking the Pacific, watching rain paint patterns on the windows. Phoenix Bloom had expanded to 23 countries. Her face was on products in stores she used to shop at when she couldn't afford to buy anything. She'd been invited to speak at conferences where billionaires paid thousands just to hear her talk about building empire from ashes. But the thing nobody put in the magazines was this. She still had hard days. Days when she wondered if revenge had been worth it. Days when she looked at Hope and worried about the complexity they'd inherit because their parents couldn't figure out how to love each other correctly the first time. Days when she caught herself missing the man Rowan could have been if he'd learned to value people over profit. Elias understood those days. He'd married her in a quiet ceremony on the beach with 30 people and no cameras. They'd built a life together that looked nothing like what Saren imagined back when she was Mrs. Castile. It was smaller in some ways, bigger in others. They fought sometimes, made up slowly, learned each other's damaged places, and chose to stay anyway. Hope was 6 now, brilliant and curious, and somehow managing to love all 3 of the adults in her life without playing favorites. She split her time between houses, never complaining, somehow understanding that families could be complicated and still be family. She had Rowan's determination and Saren's creativity and Elias's kindness. She was going to be dangerous someday, and Saren couldn't wait to see it. Rowan had rebuilt too, in his own way. Not his empire. That was gone. But himself. He ran a non-profit now, helping entrepreneurs from underserved communities build businesses without selling their souls. He never remarried, dated occasionally. Spent most of his time being the kind of father who showed up to ballet recitals and school projects and bedtime stories. He and Elias had developed a strange friendship based on mutual respect and a shared experience of loving the same woman at different times. Sometimes, late at night, when Saren couldn't sleep, she'd think about that girl in the courthouse signing divorce papers with shaking hands. She'd want to go back and tell her that it gets better, that the pain she felt in that moment was actually the beginning of something stronger. That walking away from someone who didn't value her was the most powerful thing she'd ever do. But then she'd remember that's not how time works. That girl had to walk through fire to become this woman, had to be broken to learn how to rebuild, had to lose everything to discover what actually mattered. So here's what I want you to understand, friends. Life is going to disappoint you. People you trust are going to betray you. Love is going to fail sometimes, and you're going to have to choose between staying broken or becoming dangerous. When that moment comes, and it will come for all of us, remember Saren. Remember that silence, when it's strategic, is louder than screaming. That grace under pressure is more powerful than revenge. That the best way to defeat someone who underestimated you is to become so successful they can't ignore you anymore. Don't chase what glitters. Build what glows. Don't wait for apologies from people who don't understand what they did wrong. Don't make yourself small to make others comfortable. Walk away from situations that require you to abandon yourself just to belong. And when you rebuild, build something so authentic, so powerful, so undeniably yours that nobody can ever take credit for it again. Saren Vale started with nothing but a bus ticket and a secret. She ended with an empire and peace.